Hi, everybody. Did you miss me? It's week 5, and I'll get back to week 4 in a little while. It's a little tricky to recap how gameplay works, and I want to do it justice. It's also been a pretty intense time around here in Auburn for a variety of reasons. But we're back and we're talking about Emma. This is our penultimate discussion of Emma. Discussion 3 of 4. And today we started the first half of class by just talking about what's going on in the novel. And it was really fruitfully informed by our playthrough of the Kagamatsu hack, A Single Man in Possession of Good Fortune, an Austen role playing game that is deeply about power, far more than Good Society is. If Good Society is kind of the Bridgerton esque kind of fantasy, then A Single Man in Possession of Good Fortune is very much about the real nature of power in these kinds of unbalanced moments. But more on that later. But it was a really good segue into the discussion leading that was done by one of our students, Kathy Luby's Fictions of Consent, and which traces in the Rutledge Companion to the 18th century. Traces the way that consent is imagined and who can consent. In other words, who has agency to consent and to contract in the period, which is to say, very, very few people. And it was really lovely to walk through that argument and think about the ways in which Luby's thinking on this is not only informed by the kind of traditional feminist discourses on the subject, but also by Black studies and the ways in which that and Indigenous studies and the ways in which those much more capacious and thoughtful lenses kind of pull out the frame of reference more fully and more interestingly before we snap back into how power and agency and all these sorts of things are working in Emma. And so we talked a little bit about the continuing parallels that are happening for Emma, all around Emma. We know Austen's brand is often associated with the marriage plot, and almost all of my students are familiar with the 2020 adaptation of Emma, which really trims down a lot of the things that we were focusing on about the novel. The ways in which Emma is navigating um, primarily in worlds of power relationships with women, the ways in which Emma's kind of constantly finding foils, but not equal friends, is really one of her challenges. In addition, and so while we talked about the kind of disastrous proposal from Mr. Elton, and we close read the ways in which it's a comedy of errors, right? They shouldn't even be tete-a-tete, but that it's played for a kind of laugh, but it's also as one of my students put it really beautifully, one of the things I really find fascinating is, one student was like, it's Mr. Elton is just so many men who don't see past the external, don't think of women as equal people with their own thoughts and feelings. And then another student, male identified student, very helpfully clapped back, but Emma's doing the exact same thing. In this moment, Emma and Mr. Elton are clashing because they've each been trying to run a game on the other for very different ends. They are not aligned, and they haven't been seeing each other as people, but instead as pawns. Pawns in different games, their games do not align. Thus, comedy ensues. But it is a note that we've been talking about kind of the ways in which Emma has a certain level of kind of almost masculinized freedom that she then hits the wall on. And this is one of those moments where she and Elton are much more closely inter kind of they are almost foils of each other, which I think was a really interesting way of thinking about it. We transitioned to my dear friend and mentor George Justice's argument that the Eltons, the woman, the Augusta, who Mr. Elton ultimately actually marries, that they are actually the most compatible marriage in all of Austen. And if you think about the kind of contractual nature of marriage, marriage as an enterprise. I have on my mind the terrible Atlantic article that just came out that said marriage should be between two startup co-founders rather than a merger between corporations, which was an argument for kind of late 20s, early 30s marriage, which, ugh. But very much, I mean, if we think about these things as kind of starting a new business venture, then yeah, the Eltons are remarkably kind of aligned with that. And my students took that up so readily. I texted George in the middle of class to be like, the students are all on your side. Like, and I feel bad about it. I feel icky. I mean, and I feel icky because, right, like the notion of companionate marriage, um, and the notion of marriage for reasons beyond kind of economic compatibility, um, they are aligned in their values, but their values are garbage, which is why it feels icky, at least to me. But by the by. So we talked a lot about the kind of different relations. There were digressions galore, as you might imagine. Then we took a break at about 5 o'clock to welcome my collaborator, and on so many things, including this channel that you're watching me on. Um, Emily Kugler, and we told a little bit of the story of us as co-authors, the founding of this channel, answered questions about, when to co-write, what is co-writing for, and I think that was a really interesting way for me to kind of set up some future discussions for when Quinns is here, for when Alyssa Sepinwall is here, to talk about kind of voice and also what you can do kind of collaboratively that you might not be able to do solo and vice versa, right? So Emily and I were asked, which we preferred or if we had a preference, and really the phrase that I kept coming back to is that they're differently hard. It Collaboration is hard, writing by yourself is hard. Writing in community is ideal. And I think I always write in community, even if I'm not sharing the labor of a particular task. And so we talked a little bit about the origin points of the two pieces that are linked in the description for this video. One that we collectively wrote together, our first co authored piece for the Jane Austen academic peer reviewed, open to the public. You can go find that link. Persuasions. In the wake of the George Floyd murder in 2020, there was a special issue on Austen and race that was devised for 2021. And we talked about kind of how this plays out in Austen games. And I would not have written that by myself. I could not have written that by myself. I am a constant learner over the last many years of what my colleagues who are part of the Bigger Six collective, which is kind of expanding our notion of what the romantic period looks like. The folks who are part of the Race Before Race collective. And as of this week, Patricia Matthews' new collective at Brown University, the Race and Regency Lab, all of those folks are far more better equipped, as is Emily. In terms of her own preparation for the field, than I am by myself to think about these issues. But together, we are stronger. These are really useful ways of thinking about it, like how we can kind of supplement one another. On the other hand, I spent most of the day writing something that only I can write, and only I can write it by myself. And I'm really excited for when Emily reads it. She'll be one of my first readers, along with the people that I'm writing about in this particular case, which is beyond the scope. Um, but yeah, I mean, but it's my voice because it's a more personal piece. It's a piece that's rooted very much in my perspective rather than kind of um, retreating into a collective voice which has its own kinds of strengths. And then we actually talked about the difference between, right, the thing that we wrote together and then the thing I wrote for Polygon for Video Game Fashion Week in 2022, where it was very much informed by and citing and actually kind of thinking about what Emily has contributed to our thinking and her perspective, but is written by me for Polygon. So that was a really fun and fruitful conversation, and I think it was, it went really well. We got one more discussion of Emma where it all comes together. Um, and we'll be talking about the games in Emma and how they ultimately resolve. It's really hard to talk about the games in Emma until you've gotten to the end of the novel. And since we have some students who are reading it for the very first time, you kind of have to wait. Because the games that Frank Churchill are playing that are kind of above the level of the game being played in the text, yeah, you gotta wait till the end for those. So uh, next week, we will also be discussing um, what our last text will be. So, in the weeks to come, we will move into texts in and around the Caribbean and the all too timely discussion of the um, state of the nation of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, Haitian independence, and arguably one of the most important revolutions of the age of revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th century. Ones that has impact even today, as our headlines at the time of this recording will show. But then in the final weeks of class, I've left it open to the students. And so I've presented them with four possible options that they're now going to discuss amongst themselves and come to a decision on next week. And so, first is kind of piracy and this high seas, which would be pairing the 18th century text by Daniel Defoe of Captain Singleton, ably edited by my friend and colleague Nush Powell for Broadview, with games like Monkey Island, the board game Libertalia, the CRPG that has not yet been finished, Herald, and if I'm feeling real mean, John Company. It's also a possibility to talk about Gold Teeth at that point, which is just coming out on Kickstarter, because one of my students has adopted Teeth, the core game. I would only do that if the designers of Teeth might want to come and virtually talk to us. We'll see. Option two is about sex work and sexuality. We'd be reading from the anthology Nightwalkers, which is a variety of literary and primary texts about sex work in the period, along with the memoirs of the famous courtesan Harriet Wilson. And that pairs really beautifully with Story Brewers game, which you can get free on the Story Brewers website. They're the makers of Good Society. They also did Harriet Wilson and her three sisters, which is a fascinating game about the kind of construction of the memoirs. Basically, part of the income was, hey, subscribe to my memoirs, and kind of do the crowd fund that way. But the other crowd fund that Harriet Wilson did was she wrote to her former clients and said, hey, you can buy the book or you can pay to not be in it, because it was a tell all. So that's the role playing structure of Harriet Wilson and her three sisters. Option three is Frankenstein, which for many students will have name appeal, but it is also the longest of the primary texts available. So that may be a bit off-putting in the final weeks of class, and that would be put into conversation with probably the kind of board slash puzzly game box set Mother of Frankenstein gives me an excuse to buy it, as well as the CRPG The Wanderer, which Emily Kugler has been teaching to great effect over at Howard. Finally, also via Diodati and the Year Without a Summer, and that the Cradle of Frankenstein also gave us The Vampire by John Polidori, a much shorter text to read, and of course one that has many possibilities. But the one that's closest to my heart is Thousand Year Old Vampire. Not just because Tim has been to one of my TTRPG classes. You can find the information about that somewhere in the YouTube archives, but also because Thousand Year Old Vampire has spawned and will hopefully be at my doorstep 500-Year Old Vampire, which is a peer reviewed, designed for classroom use version of the game from Central Michigan University Press. But also things like literally just arrived on my doorstep today, guys. Tales from the Gods, which is a kind of descended from. Uh, or based on the award-winning Thousand Year Old Vampire system. So another solo RPG that's really helpful. And I'm also just really excited to show this translated version of Thousand Year Old Vampire, which is also on my doorstep. So hooray! Very and while I'm at it, I also use this as an excuse since I was ordering both of those to finally get find all the junk in a wide Sargasso Sea of space, which I mean that's more of a Jane Eyre parallel, I guess. But any excuse to I can write it off on my taxes. Educational materials, ding. So those are the options that I'm going to be putting forward for the students to debate. There are 6 of them, so it could be an even split, but I'm hoping that they're going to come to some kind of consensus. I have asked the bookstore in a kind of unusual move to hold basically all the primary texts, which are almost all broad views. Um, in fact, they may all be broad views. Usually by this point, the bookstore would have returned all of these books to the publisher. But I said, could you please hold on to them for like a couple, like till mid semester, so that the students can buy only the books that they end up needing. So we'll see how that goes, and and move from there. So yeah, Emma has been going really, really well, and I'm excited for what bubbles up next. And if you have questions or comments or thoughts, of course, please put them in the comments below. I'm happy to answer questions either textually or in the next video. Like I said, I hope to circle back to thinking about how I ran, or rather, had students mostly run. A single man in possession of good fortune. The week 4 class time was devoted to that, and debrief. We managed to fit it in the 2.5 ish hours that we've got. I think it worked really nicely, and I'm thinking about how it could be compressed as an actual play for a conference that I'm hoping to take some kind of actual play to for Jane Austen's birthday next year. But more on that in the fullness of time. Until then, it's lovely to see you all, and I hope you are all very well.